fiber evidence, transfer mechanics, and trace analysis. We've walked through blankets that spoke of maternal care and wine cellars that revealed geographic knowledge. We've traced pineapple that rewrote timelines and flashlights bearing no prints. And now we need to descend into something microscopic, something that exists at the intersection of the visible and invisible, something so small that individual pieces cannot be seen without magnification, yet so significant that their patterns tell stories about contact, about proximity, about who touched what and when. We need to think about fibers, not threads we can see with naked eyes, but microscopic textile fragments that transfer from surface to surface whenever contact occurs, creating invisible maps of interaction that forensic examination can render visible. Because here's what sits quietly in the laboratory reports, waiting to be understood. Fibers consistent with Patsy Ramsey's clothing were found in locations where their presence requires explanation. Not everywhere. That would be expected in a house where she lived. But in specific places, on specific items, in patterns that create questions about when contact occurred and what that contact means for understanding the sequence of events we've been examining. Let's establish what we understand about fiber evidence before we begin to interpret its significance. From a forensic perspective, every textile, every garment, every blanket, every fabric surface sheds microscopic fibers constantly. These fibers transfer through contact, adhering to surfaces through static electricity, mechanical friction, or simple entanglement. The transfer happens automatically, unconsciously, unavoidably. We cannot touch fabric without potential for fiber transfer. We cannot handle fabric items without our own clothing leaving traces. And these traces persist, creating records of contact that can be examined days, weeks, sometimes even months after the interaction occurred. The science of fiber analysis involves microscopic examination of these traces, comparing them to known samples, determining whether matches exist and what those matches tell us about who handled what, who was near what, whose clothing came into contact with items or locations whose significance we're trying to understand. Theme 1. The architecture of transfer, what microscopic traces preserve. When we think about how fibers move from one surface to another, we're thinking about physics at microscopic scale. From a forensic perspective, fiber transfer requires contact, not proximity, not being in the same room, but actual physical contact between textile sources and receiving surfaces. This is fundamental to understanding what fiber evidence means. It tells us about touch, about handling, about proximity, close enough for surfaces to meet. And different types of contact create different patterns of transfer. Direct contact, touching an item with hands clothed in a particular garment, creates primary transfer, fibers moving directly from the garment to the item. Secondary transfer occurs when fibers that have already transferred to one surface then transfer again to another surface, creating chains of evidence that become more tenuous with each step removed from original source. Understanding which type of transfer occurred matters for interpreting what the fibers tell us about interaction and timing. Let's think about what makes certain fibers more or less likely to transfer and persist. From a physiological standpoint, some textile types shed more readily than others. Wool releases fibers easily, creates high transfer rates, leaves extensive trace evidence. Synthetic materials can be more stable, shedding less, but often creating fibers that are more persistent once transferred because they carry stronger static charge. And the condition of the garment matters. New items shed more than worn ones. Damaged areas shed more than intact areas. Areas experiencing high friction during wear shed more than areas that experience minimal movement. So when we examine fiber evidence, we're not just looking at what was found, but asking what characteristics of the source garment would make these fibers likely to transfer. What does the transfer rate tell us about the condition and type of contact that occurred? From a criminological perspective, fiber evidence becomes significant when we find matches in locations where innocent explanation is difficult. If we find fibers from a mother's sweater on her child's clothing, that's entirely expected. Mothers dress their children, hug them, engage in constant contact that would create extensive fiber transfer. But if we find those same fibers in locations or on items where contact wasn't part of normal interaction, where the mother's stated activities wouldn't account for the transfer, then we have evidence requiring explanation. Not proof of anything in isolation, but a detail that needs accounting for within the larger narrative about what occurred. And when we find multiple such details, when fiber evidence compounds other forensic traces, patterns emerge that transform individual elements from curiosities into components of larger understanding. Now let's consider what timing information fiber evidence can and cannot provide. From a physiological perspective, fibers don't come with timestamps. We can determine that transfer occurred, but determining precisely when becomes more complex. However, fiber persistence studies tell us about windows. Fresh transfers typically show more numerous fibers than older transfers because some fibers fall away with time, handling, movement. High concentrations of matching fibers suggest relatively recent transfer compared to sparse findings that might represent older contact. And protected locations, surfaces that weren't subsequently touched or cleaned, preserve evidence better than exposed locations where normal activity might remove transferred fibers. So while we cannot pinpoint the hour or minute of transfer, we can sometimes establish whether we're looking at recent contact versus older residue, whether patterns suggest activity during the critical window we're investigating or simply reflect the normal accumulation of daily life. Let's shift to thinking about what location patterns tell us. From an anthropological perspective, where we find transferred fibers matters as much as what we find. Fibers on surfaces that were handled during normal daily activity tell us little beyond that normal activity occurred. But fibers in locations that required unusual contact, that suggest specific types of interaction, that appear in spaces or on items where routine explanation becomes strained. These create questions demanding answers. If fibers from a specific garment appear in the wine cellar, where normal daily activity wouldn't take someone wearing that garment, if they appear on items involved in what occurred, if they appear in patterns suggesting not casual contact but sustained proximity or repeated handling, then we're looking at evidence that shapes understanding of who was where and what they were doing during hours when the official narrative says they were elsewhere, engaged in different activities. From a philosophical perspective, we need to ask, what's the relationship between microscopic evidence and large-scale truth? Individual fibers are so small, so apparently insignificant, that it's tempting to dismiss them as meaningless traces of daily life, coincidental transfers that happen to be preserved and discovered, but that tell us nothing important. But forensic science operates from different premises, that every contact leaves trace, that these traces aggregate into patterns, that patterns reveal interaction histories that witnesses might not accurately remember or might have reasons not to accurately report. The microscopic becomes significant precisely because it operates below the level of conscious awareness. People can carefully manage what they say occurred, can construct narratives about their activities and whereabouts, but they cannot manage microscopic fiber transfer. Fibers go where physics takes them, persist according to the laws governing adhesion and static charge, create records of contact that exist independently of human intention or testimony. From a criminological standpoint, fiber evidence often becomes most significant not in isolation, but in combination with other evidence types. A single fiber match might mean little. Coincidence, cross-contamination, innocent transfer from some earlier interaction. But when fiber evidence aligns with other forensic findings, when it corroborates witness testimony or contradicts it in revealing ways, when it appears in patterns that make sense only under certain scenarios about what occurred, then its significance multiplies. We're not looking at proof in the sense that a single fiber definitively establishes guilt or involvement. We're looking at threads, literal and figurative, that weave together with other evidence to create tapestries of understanding, patterns that help us see not definitive proof, but increasing probability, not certainty, but direction, not answers to every question, but illumination of which questions most deserve our attention. So when we step back and consider the architecture of transfer, how fibers move from surface to surface, what makes transfer more or less likely, what location patterns reveal, what timing information can sometimes be inferred, we're building foundation for understanding what specific fiber findings in this case might mean. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, fiber evidence operates as microscopic testimony to contact, to proximity, to interactions that occurred, whether or not those interactions align with stated narratives. The traces are small, but their stories can be large, their patterns revealing, their presence in specific locations at specific stages of investigation, creating questions that testimony alone might never prompt us to ask. And as we move forward to examine the specific fiber evidence in this case, as we think about what was found and where and what explanations have been offered and what explanations those findings actually support, we'll carry this understanding of transfer mechanics, this recognition that microscopic traces preserve truths about contact and proximity that larger evidence sometimes conceals, that the invisible often reveals what the visible was meant to hide. Theme 2, the pattern of presence. What specific findings tell us? We've established how fiber transfer works, and now we need to examine what was actually found in this case and what those findings mean when we apply our understanding of transfer mechanics. From a forensic perspective, the laboratory reports documented fibers consistent with Patsy's jacket, a distinctive red and black garment she had worn that evening, in several locations. Not everywhere, not creating a pattern suggesting she moved freely through all spaces, but in specific places whose significance creates questions. Some of these locations align with normal expectation. Her child's body would naturally bear fibers from maternal contact throughout the day and evening. But other locations, other items, create patterns less easily explained through routine interaction, patterns that suggest presence or contact during hours when the official narrative places her elsewhere, asleep in her bed, unaware of what was unfolding in the house below. Let's think about what primary versus secondary transfer tells us about the findings. From a physiological perspective, high concentrations of matching fibers suggest primary transfer, direct contact between the garment and the receiving surface. Lower concentrations might suggest secondary transfer, fibers that moved through intermediate surfaces before reaching their final location. The reports indicated findings in locations where primary transfer seems most likely explanation, where the concentration and distribution of fibers suggests not just casual brush-past contact, but sustained proximity, perhaps repeated contact, the kind of fiber deposition that occurs when someone wearing a shedding garment spends time in a location or handles items in ways that create multiple opportunities for transfer. This distinction matters because it shapes our understanding of whether we're looking at traces from earlier, innocent contact or evidence of presence during the critical hours. From a criminological perspective, we need to think about which findings create the most significant questions. Fibers on her body. This we would expect from maternal handling throughout the day, from bedtime routines, from the kind of contact mothers and children have constantly. But fibers reported on items involved in staging, fibers in the wine cellar, where the official narrative doesn't place Patsy during critical hours, fibers on surfaces that wouldn't naturally receive transfer through daily interaction. These create interpretive challenges. We need to ask, when did the transfer occur? Under what circumstances would Patsy's jacket shed fibers to these specific locations? Can innocent explanations account for the patterns? Or do the patterns suggest presence during hours when that presence contradicts stated narratives? Now let's consider what cross-contamination means and whether it can explain the findings. From a forensic perspective, contamination is always possible. Fibers can transfer through investigator handling, through storage of evidence in proximity, through any number of pathways that don't reflect original crime scene conditions. And this possibility must always be considered when evaluating fiber evidence. But contamination typically creates different patterns than original transfer. Contamination tends to be sparse, random, affecting multiple items without clear relationship between them. Original transfer tends to be concentrated, patterned, appearing in ways that make sense given the mechanics of how contact occurred. The fiber evidence in this case, according to analysts who have examined it, shows patterns more consistent with original transfer than with contamination, concentrations and distributions that suggest genuine contact rather than secondary introduction through handling or storage. Let's shift to thinking about what timing we can infer from fiber evidence patterns. From a physiological standpoint, Patsy wore the jacket that evening. This is documented, uncontested. She would have removed it at some point, presumably when preparing for bed. So the question becomes, when did transfers occur relative to when she was wearing the garment? Fibers on her child's body might have transferred at any point during the evening, during the party, during the car ride home, during bedtime preparations. But fibers in locations suggesting activity during staging hours, create different timing questions. If high concentrations of matching fibers appear in locations where Patsy's stated activities wouldn't take her while wearing the jacket, we need explanations for how transfer occurred. Did she handle items while still wearing the jacket? During hours she stated she was in bed? Did fibers transfer through some indirect pathway we haven't identified? Or do the patterns suggest presence in locations during hours that contradict the timeline we've been given? From an anthropological lens, we need to understand that fiber evidence doesn't exist in isolation. It needs to be interpreted within broader context of all evidence and testimony. The fibers themselves simply tell us about contact, about proximity, about transfer that occurred through some mechanism. What that contact means, what it tells us about who was, where, when, depends on integrating fiber findings with everything else we know. If fiber evidence aligns with other forensic findings that suggest Patsy's presence during staging hours, if it corroborates patterns we've seen in other evidence types, then its significance multiplies. But if it stands alone, if no other evidence supports the timeline implications, then we need to be more cautious about interpretation, more open to alternative explanations, including contamination or unusual secondary transfer pathways we haven't fully understood. From a philosophical perspective, we're confronting the relationship between microscopic evidence and reasonable doubt. How much weight should we give to fiber evidence? Individual fibers can be matched to source garments, but absolute certainty about when and how transfer occurred often remains elusive, and this creates interpretive space. Prosecutors might argue fiber evidence proves presence. Defense might argue contamination or innocent transfer, and both positions can seem reasonable depending on how we weight different possibilities. What fiber evidence primarily does is create questions, prompt investigation, suggest areas where testimony might be incomplete or inaccurate. It doesn't typically provide standalone proof, but rather contributes to cumulative understanding, adding weight to interpretations supported by other evidence types, while raising questions about narratives that must strain to explain fiber patterns. So when we consider the pattern of presence, what specific fiber findings tell us, how transfer mechanics shape interpretation, whether patterns suggest original contact or contamination, what timing can be inferred, how fiber evidence integrates with other forensic findings. We're seeing how microscopic traces create large questions. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the fiber evidence in this case doesn't stand alone as proof of anything definitive, but it adds to the cumulative pattern we've been building across these chapters. Fibers from Patsy's jacket appearing in specific locations, in concentrations and patterns, suggesting primary transfer, in places where stated activities wouldn't obviously account for their presence. These findings create questions about the timeline, about who was where during critical hours, about whether testimony accurately reflects activity, or whether evidence whispers of presence that hasn't been acknowledged. The traces are small, but what they suggest about contact, about proximity, about interactions that occurred during hours when distance and isolation were supposedly being maintained. These suggestions align with other evidence we've examined, creating patterns where individual details might be explained away, but cumulative weight becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss as merely coincidence or contamination or innocent transfer from earlier, unrelated interactions. Theme 3. The weight of accumulation. When traces become pattern. We've examined what fiber evidence tells us about presence and contact, and now we need to confront what it means when fiber findings exist, not in isolation, but within the larger constellation of evidence we've been examining across these chapters. Because this is where forensic investigation differs from legal proof. We're not looking for single definitive elements that establish truth beyond all doubt. We're looking for patterns, for accumulation, for the ways different evidence types corroborate or contradict each other until overall shape emerges with clarity that individual elements alone couldn't provide. The fiber evidence doesn't prove Patsy was present during staging, but it suggests contact occurred, proximity existed, interactions happened that align with scenarios where she was present rather than scenarios where she was absent, sleeping in her bed, unaware of what was unfolding below. Let's think about what it means when multiple evidence types point in the same direction. From a logical perspective, any single element might have innocent explanation. The handwriting similarities might be coincidence, or the expert might be wrong. The $118,000 amount might have been learned through unusual means. The fiber evidence might reflect contamination. The undisturbed bed might mean she left peacefully with someone she trusted. Each element, examined alone, allows for alternative explanation. But when these elements accumulate, when we see fiber evidence alongside handwriting patterns, alongside timeline problems, alongside insider knowledge, alongside all the other details we've traced, the likelihood that each has innocent explanation independent of the others becomes strained. Probability multiplies. What was plausible individually becomes implausible collectively. And patterns emerge that suggest not multiple coincidences, but single underlying reality, manifesting in multiple evidence types. From a criminological perspective, this is how cases develop, through accumulation rather than single dramatic revelation. Television and movies train us to expect the smoking gun, the one piece of evidence that definitively proves guilt or innocence. But real investigation typically works through accretion, building understanding gradually as evidence types corroborate each other, as testimony proves consistent or inconsistent with physical findings, as the spaces between what was said and what was found grow wider until they cannot be bridged through reasonable explanation. The fiber evidence is one piece in this larger pattern, not the piece that proves everything, but a piece that aligns with other pieces that make sense within frameworks suggested by other evidence, that creates problems for alternative explanations in ways that compound rather than contradict other forensic findings. Now let's think about what burden this places on alternative explanations. From a philosophical perspective, when evidence accumulates in patterns pointing toward particular interpretations, those who disagree with those interpretations bear burden of explaining not just individual elements but the entire pattern. It's not enough to say contamination might explain the fiber evidence. We also need to explain the handwriting similarities, the timeline problems, the insider knowledge, the extended presence required for staging, the maternal hearing that apparently didn't detect what neighbors heard, all the elements we've been building. and as alternative explanations must account for more and more evidence, as they must accommodate increasingly complex patterns through increasingly elaborate coincidences. At some point, the simpler explanation that the evidence patterns reflect underlying reality rather than multiple unrelated anomalies begins to seem more compelling than maintaining that each element has innocent explanation, independent of the others. Let's shift to considering what this means for how we understand what occurred that night. From a psychological perspective, if we accept that evidence patterns suggest Patsy's presence during critical hours, we're not necessarily talking about cold calculation or criminal intent in the way those terms typically function. We might be talking about something more complex, a mother processing unbearable discovery, making impossible decisions about how to protect surviving child and family structure, operating in dissociated state where normal moral frameworks temporarily ceased functioning, engaging in staging not from criminal mindset, but from desperate need to create alternative to truth that would destroy everything. The fiber evidence in this reading becomes trace of someone who was there, who handled items and spent time in locations during hours when terrible necessities were being faced, who left microscopic evidence of presence despite all efforts to create appearance that she was elsewhere, sleeping peacefully while unknown intruder supposedly moved through her house. From an anthropological lens, we can examine how families respond to internal crises that threaten family survival, and what those responses look like in terms of evidence patterns. When terrible things happen within families and decisions are made to conceal rather than reveal, family members often work together in ways that create exactly the kind of accumulated evidence we're examining. Different people contribute different pieces. One might write notes, another might handle physical staging, another might manage timeline construction through carefully prepared statements. And each contribution leaves traces, handwriting patterns, fiber transfers, timeline inconsistencies that accumulate into patterns suggesting coordinated response rather than single individual acting alone. The fiber evidence might reflect not Patsy acting independently, but Patsy participating in family response, her presence during critical hours part of larger pattern of family members doing what they believed necessary to protect what could still be protected after one child was lost and circumstances threatened to claim another through consequences that truth would bring. From a criminological standpoint, we need to think about what evidence patterns like this typically mean for investigation and prosecution. In most cases, accumulated evidence of this type would drive intensive focus on the person or people whose traces appear throughout the pattern, whose presence is suggested by multiple evidence types, whose involvement is harder to dismiss as evidence accumulates. That this didn't happen in the same way in this case, that investigation followed other paths despite evidence accumulation, raises questions about why certain interpretations were pursued while others were minimized or dismissed. Not questions suggesting conspiracy or misconduct necessarily, but questions about how initial framing shapes subsequent investigation, about how narratives established early become difficult to dislodge even when evidence suggests they might be incomplete or inaccurate, about the ways privilege and position can shape how evidence gets weighted and what conclusions seem plausible to investigators and prosecutors. So, when we consider the weight of accumulation, how fiber evidence combines with other forensic findings, what patterns emerge when we examine not individual elements but their constellation, what this suggests about presence and activity during critical hours, we see the culmination of the journey we've been taking through this evidence. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the fiber evidence doesn't stand alone but takes its place in larger pattern, contributing its microscopic testimony to understanding built from pineapple and practice notes, from handwriting and hearing, from flashlights and wine cellars, from blankets and all the other elements we've examined. Each detail might be explained away individually, but cumulatively, collectively, the pattern they create becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence or contamination or a series of unrelated anomalies that happened to accumulate around the same people, the same timeline, the same terrible events. The fibers traced contact. The handwriting suggested authorship. The timeline showed impossibilities. The biological evidence contradicted testimony. The staging revealed extended presence. And through it all, the patterns point not outward toward unknown intruders, but inward toward family, toward people who had access and knowledge and time and terrible necessity to create alternative to truth that would have destroyed what remained after loss had already taken so much. The microscopic becomes macroscopic. The invisible traces become visible patterns. And what emerges, built from accumulation of evidence across forensic types and analytical perspectives, is understanding that refuses the comfortable narratives, that insists on facing what the evidence whispers, even when those whispers tell stories we would prefer not to hear. We've descended into the microscopic and emerged with understanding of patterns, of how tiny textile fragments preserve stories about contact and proximity and presence during hours when distance was supposed to be maintained. The fiber evidence sits in laboratory reports, documented and analyzed, creating questions about when transfer occurred and what that transfer means for understanding who was where during the terrible hours between loss and discovery. Individual fibers might mean little, coincidence, contamination, innocent transfer from earlier interactions. But when those fibers appear in patterns that align with other evidence we've examined, when they suggest presence during hours, the official narrative requires absence. When they contribute to the cumulative weight of forensic findings that all point in similar directions, they become more than microscopic traces. They become testament to presence, to contact, to interactions that occurred whether or not those interactions have been acknowledged. Someone's clothing shed fibers during those hours. Someone's proximity to items and locations involved in what occurred left traces that microscopic examination could render visible. And those traces, combined with everything else we've seen, the handwriting that couldn't be excluded, the insider knowledge that revealed too much, the timeline that biology contradicted, the staging that required extended presence, the blanket that spoke of maternal care even in extremity, create patterns that accumulate into understanding. Not legal proof beyond reasonable doubt, perhaps, but forensic suggestion compelling enough that doubt itself begins to feel like resistance to what evidence whispers, what patterns reveal, what microscopic testimony preserves about a night when the invisible traces left behind told stories that no staging could entirely conceal, no timeline could successfully obscure, no distance could make distant enough to prevent fibers from transferring, contact from leaving traces, presence from being recorded in the very fabric of events that unfolded during those hours when a house that should have been sleeping instead bore witness to terrible necessities that left evidence in scales both large and microscopic, both visible and requiring magnification to see clearly, but all pointing toward the same troubling understanding of who was present, who knew, and what really occurred during the hours we've been examining through 18 chapters of accumulated evidence that refuse to support the narratives we were given and instead insist on truths that no one wanted to face.